Hey guys, so today we're going to be looking at how elemental mastery works and how does it scale into its actual reaction damage. Okay, so what I'm going to be looking at is the actual raw number. How does it affect this increased damage caused by overloads, superconduct, etc., this percentage, as well as vaporize and melts, okay? So I'm only looking at those bonus damage percentages. I'm not actually looking at the overall raw number that you're going to get, just the bonus damage in terms of percent. So I'm going to be analyzing the raw number of elemental mastery, as in this number, and comparing it or trying to determine how it scales over time as you increase it. So in order to do this, I had to split up the analysis into two main categories because of how the percentage works and how the actual multiplier works. I'm not going to get into that, so we're just going to look at this. The overload category is a lot higher than the melt and vaporize category, and there's a reason for that, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. We're just going to be looking at these two categories, okay? And we're going to neglect shield and crystallize because I'm mostly concerned about the more common characters, which are the ones that do these kinds of reactions, okay? So the first question I had, because I've been doing a lot of analysis on the game, is does elemental mastery scale linearly? Everything else seems to do that. So that's what I wanted to do. So I had to acquire some data based off of my characters. And then I wanted to make sure that the different characters actually scale similarly, or at least this, not similarly, but the same. So I was testing to see if elemental mastery was actually character independent. 17, 7.93.3. 17, 7.93.3. So character independent. So when you have no elemental mastery, you have nothing at all, you actually get 0, 0. So you don't actually get any bonus damage. And as you increase it, it actually starts to scale. At first glance, when you scale with very low numbers of elemental mastery, it seems to be linear. But over time, as you increase it, let's say to Shangling's 400 that I have right now, it actually begins to no longer be linear. So the conclusion that I got is that it's actually more quadratic scaling. So that means you will have diminishing returns at higher values of elemental mastery, but it's not by that much. And the other conclusion I had was that elemental mastery is indeed character independent. So that means no matter which character you look at, it scales the same, unless there's some kind of talent that exists for that specific character, something very specific. Otherwise, they're very much the analysis is character independent. So what I did was I combined a bunch of data from a couple characters, put it into one, just so I can have quite a few points, and then I ended up getting a plot. So let's actually look at the plot. So we can switch to my plot really quick. So here, what we can see is the two curves for both overload damage. So in blue, I've plotted the overload reaction data, and in red, I've plotted the melt reaction. So those are the scatter points, the circles that you see, individual points. And then I did a couple fits, okay? So I did a linear fit and a quadratic fit to see how it actually scales. And what you can see by eye, instead of like from the math, you can just look at it by eye. The linear fits are not as good as the quadratic fits. Okay, so what I've chosen to do is outline the function associated with each fit for both in blue and red, the blue being the overloads and the red being the vaporized melts. And what you can see is there's a very small dependence on the squared term, and it's mostly in the linear term. That's because they're almost linear. There's actually it's not that quadratic. So anyway, the function is mostly linear, but it will diminish over time. Okay, so it is more quadratic in nature based off of the fit. Okay, so that was the main conclusion on how elemental mastery scales your overall reaction bonus damage. Okay, now you're going to ask me, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, it matters when you're trying to determine what set to farm for, okay? And there's quite a few sets in the game. So if we look at some of them, let's pull up some of them. The Thundering Fury set, which at 4-piece increases your reaction damage for these electric types by 40%. Venerer set, which is increasing your swirl damage by 60%. That falls under the overload category. Okay, so if we go look at that again, the swirl damage falls in the the overload category. The third set I was looking at was the Crimson Witch set, which increases overload and burning by 40%, but also vaporize by 50%. And that's because vaporize and melt are on two different categories. We talked about that, right? That's why this is smaller than this number. I'm neglecting the burning damage here. I'm mainly looking at the reaction damage. That's what the analysis is focused on, okay? Any other additional bonus to this set was not included in my analysis. I'll touch on that at the end. I just wanted to strictly look at the reaction damage, because my gut says, well, this is clearly better in every way. But if we look at the math, if we look at the results, it actually tells a little bit of a different story, so it gets a little bit more interesting. So if we come back to the graphs here, what I did is I plotted a line at the 80 elemental mastery raw value. And the reason why I did this is because the 2-piece set for instructors and for Wanderer's Troop are 80 elemental mastery. That's what you typically get off those pieces. So if we want to compare the two artifact sets, we're going to have to look at the 80 elemental mastery mark. How much bonus damage do you get on your overloads, etc., versus your melts, etc., to compare them to the 4-piece elemental sets? So if we look at that point exactly on this graph, what we get is the overload damage bonus that we would get for 80 elemental mastery is about 36%. When we compare that to the elemental mastery for melt, we get 15%. And if you recall, just like what I was talking about, the Thundering set gave 40% overload damage bonus, and the Crimson set gave 15% melt damage. So what we're seeing here is that based off of reaction damage alone, these two are the same. So what's happened here is that the devs have put basically an instructor 2-piece set or Wanderer's Troop 2-piece set inherently in the 4-piece elemental sets. Okay, and then they added a little bit of a buff, like a little bonus, so each one has like a little thing. So if we go back, the Thundering set, its extra bonus is decreasing the elemental skill CD by 1 second every time you trigger an effect. That's the extra little bonus. The Venerer set is the only exception to this. It has actually increased its swirl by 60%. I'll touch on this at the end. But its little buff is resistance decrease. And the final piece that I was looking at was the Crimson set, which gives you increased pyro damage bonus every time you use your E, and it can stack depending on your character. So that's the extra little bonus. So if we're strictly looking at reaction damage, what we see is Instructor and Wanderer's Troop is essentially the same, okay? So then the question comes down to the final piece that you need to decide for yourselves is, well, does the bonus matter for my character? Okay, does that bonus matter for my character? Because otherwise it's a bit of a wash. You should just equip whatever gear substats is better for you at the time. The only exception that I'm going to highlight is the Venerer set. I said I would touch on it. For whatever reason, that one's giving you 60% swirl instead of 40% in the other two sets. So for whatever reason, that one's 60%. So I would argue that that is actually much stronger. It's way more significant. So you'd have to do a little bit more testing to see if your substats would actually even match that. So that's why on my Venti, I'm already pushing for the Venerer set, even though the substats aren't particularly great, because the buffs are so significant. Okay, so feel free to use these functions on your own to test how much reaction bonus damage you'd get. They seem to scale all the way up to at least 500, okay, which covers, I think, the majority of people's power level on their elemental mastery right now. So feel free to use them for either case to determine which set is better for you, and I hope that was very insightful, that you learned something about the game and how elemental mastery works, and in what kind of case this analysis you can apply it to benefit your characters best. Okay, so thanks guys for listening. If you have any questions, I'd like to see them in the comments and I'll answer them as best I can. If you have any suggestions or something you'd like me to analyze, let me know. I'd be happy to do so, okay? Cheers.